Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. After days of uncertainty, Maine Democratic Senate nominee Graham Platner announced he intends to withdraw from the race as support from Democrats in Maine and beyond evaporated after a former girlfriend went public with allegations he raped her in 2021, which Platner denies. In an 11-minute video posted on X last night, Platner sounded both aggrieved and defiant, saying his decision to suspend his campaign was not an admission of guilt, while repeatedly blaming the Democratic establishment for pushing him out of the race.
It's not the false allegations, though, that have brought us to where we are. It's the fact that they are being used by the political establishment to put structural pressure on us. We live in a political system that is not built for normal people. It is a system that is built structurally to make sure that movements like ours cannot flourish. That if they begin to succeed, they can be crushed. People in D.C. need to stay in D.C. Decisions should not be made in back rooms by people in places of political power. We did it the right way. We built a campaign. We engaged in electoral politics. We motivated people. We banded together. We did it the way that we were told we are supposed to make change. And we won. And now they are not going to let us have it. Not if it's me. And so we're suspending campaign operations. We were asking for real democracy, and we did it the right way, and we won. But now the ball is in the court of the Democratic establishment.
Now, we should note, as of this hour, Platner has not formally filed paperwork to withdraw from the race. He has until 5 p.m. Monday to do so, or his name will remain on the ballot. Sources tell NBC News Platner plans to wait until that Monday deadline before officially filing to withdraw. Meanwhile, the Maine Democratic Party is charting a post-Platner path forward, with the executive director of the state party laying out their next steps.
What I care about is that Mainers feel represented in this process, that they feel included in this process, that we have the full transparency every single step of the way for folks to understand where we are at. And where we are at right now is that we do have a vote to move forward with a nominating convention that will happen at some point prior to July 27th. If you are a candidate that is interested in participating in that, it is critical that you start talking to Maine voters about the values that we saw drive such historic turnout in the primary we just had on June 9th.
Now, so far, at least 6 candidates have put their name forward to replace Platner and take on Senator Susan Collins in November, including multiple candidates who fell short in this year's governor's race. Former Maine CDC Director Nirav Shah, former State Senator Troy Jackson, and Maine Secretary of State Shinna Bellows, as well as candidates who ran unsuccessfully in the Senate primary, environmental consultant David Costello and businessman Dan Kleben. Also jumping in, Jordan Wood, a former congressional staffer who fell short in the primary for Maine's 2nd district. Now, one of the biggest tests for these candidates will be how much they stick to Platner's progressive platform while distancing themselves from Platner. One of those candidates telling me on this show yesterday he would not accept Platner's endorsement. Look,
when it came down to a credible allegation of somebody that was sexually assaulted, that was the end. That was the bright red line. I don't feel bad, for supporting those causes because that's who I am. I do feel bad that there was a woman that was sexually assaulted, and that's why I've quit supporting Graham. But I'm not going to quit fighting for everyday working class people.
Would you want and would you welcome Graham Platner's support and endorsement, or do you worry that that could drag your candidacy down?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want it. And it's, it's unfortunate, but I just don't want it.
I would not accept an endorsement from Graham, nor have I sought one. This race is now about the people who supported Graham and our efforts to defeat Susan Collins. It is not about Graham. And so what I am focused on is speaking with and getting the endorsements of his supporters.
I would not accept Graham Platner's endorsement, but I would reiterate that I do agree with a lot of his policy positions, and I intend to continue to amplify a lot of the things that he was saying on the trail.
Joining me now is Chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles and senior national political reporter Sahil Kapur. Thanks to both of you for being here. Ryan, I want to start off with you in this new reporting that you have. Sources are telling you that Graham Platner does not, in fact, plan to withdraw his name until Monday officially. That's the deadline. What are the implications of that? Why is he waiting?
I think he's going to make a lot of Democrats in Maine white knuckle this right up until the very end. I'm told that Platner has made it very clear to his campaign staff that he is not going to submit his paperwork until the Monday deadline. And you saw him wave at this a little bit in his video last night, where he said that he's still very concerned about the process that it's going to take to replace him. And he wants to make sure that process is open and transparent, not run by what he called insiders from Washington, but instead run by grassroots Democrats in Maine. Now, there's no reason to think that he's going to change his mind and decide not to continue on in this race. But until he puts his name on a piece of paper that says he's no longer the nominee, he is the state's nominee. And if for some reason he changes his mind, they could be in real trouble come Monday.
Well, the image of them white knuckling it, I think, is apt in this instance, Sahil, because you can feel the frustration amongst Democrats as they wait for him to officially withdraw his name. Can Maine Democrats start to move forward, start to look for alternatives in earnest until he's officially withdrawn his name? What does it mean for this process overall?
Yeah, they absolutely can plan for the process, because all that needs to happen is he needs to withdraw, and then they have 2 weeks between July 13th and July 27th to pick a nominee. Now, the state party is insisting this is going to be a fair, transparent, inclusive process. They need to have the buy-in of voters that they have any shot at unifying this fractious party. I spoke to a Maine Democrat who helped write the bylaws. They said they're making it up as they go along.
Wow.
There's nothing in the bylaws for a contingency like this, for a situation like this. They didn't put anything in there. What they're planning now is a convention that could be, I'm told, as late as 1 or 2 days before that July 27th deadline. They want to create a maximum amount of time for the candidates, many of whom aren't well known, to get their names out. There are going to be hundreds of delegates chosen by voters. That's the input that voters will have, even if it's indirect. And there's going to be a requirement of a minimum number of signatures to qualify, so that literally anybody can't get in there.
You know, Ryan, one of the big themes that is emerging from that extraordinary video, 11-minute video that Graham Platner put out, his defiance, his anger. He never once apologizes to anyone for anything. And this sense that he puts the blame squarely on the establishment. Does that run the risk of complicating whoever the nominee becomes, their efforts to try to unify Maine Democrats and, quite frankly, win over some independents in a general election?
Listen, whoever becomes Graham Platner's replacement is going to spend all of their time distancing themselves from Graham Platner, because I can guarantee you that the Susan Collins campaign and national Republicans are still already cooking up ads that are going to tie whoever that nominee is right next to Graham Platner. Because up until like 3 days ago, every one of these Democrats was running arm in arm with Graham Platner because he was still very popular with the Democratic base. And you've seen it already play out today in some of the public pronouncements that we've seen from some of these candidates, where they go to great pains to say, I've got no interest in Graham. Graham is in the past. I want to talk about Graham. But I'm very passionately courting his supporters. I believe in the things that Graham stood for. I don't believe in Graham's personal conduct. I don't associate with that. But this is going to be the very delicate line and the very difficult needle that they're going to be forced to thread, finding a way to corral that energy that he had without bringing the baggage along with it. And that will not be any easy task.
So I'll pick up on that point. Just how challenging is that going to be, especially going up against a Susan Collins, someone who is not just a veteran of the Senate, but someone who knows how to and who has proven she can win tough races.
Yeah, absolutely. Susan Collins has won every election since 1996, even though Maine has not elected or voted for a Democratic president since the 1980s. So she knows how to navigate that state, and she's an institution in that state. The first thing these Democrats have to do is figure out a way to win the nomination. And the campaigning situation is a little bit chaotic, to say the least. Yeah. Take a look at some footage we have. Our colleague Brennan Leach is on the ground in Freeport, Maine. Niraj Shah had a campaign event, a launch event today, where they're repurposing signs that he used from his governor campaign, failed governor campaign. They're crossing out the word governor with paint or with white tape, and they're putting senator on it. We also caught some people, their stickers, Shah for governor stickers. They're cutting off the governor part of those stickers and handing out just where it says Shah. So this is how you try to do a campaign with no lead time to prepare. There are also candidates who, let's put that row of candidates back up. They're trying to carve out their own lanes here. Shah is making an electability pitch. You've got Troy Jackson, the former Senate president, as well as Jordan Wood, to some extent, trying to run in the progressive lane. Shenna Bellows, the Secretary of State who ran against Susan Collins. She was the nominee in 2014, got absolutely walloped by 37 points by Collins. Democrats hope that she's better known now. She's gotten elected statewide. And then there are a couple of outsiders, Dan Kleben, founder of Maine Beer Company, and David Costello running as well.
And there's two important themes, I think, that Sahil touched on that I want to amplify.
Yeah.
The fact that so many of these candidates have failed in contests in Maine, and that's emphasized by the fact that they're repurposing this campaign paraphernalia. This is campaign paraphernalia from a losing campaign, and now they're trying to convince voters they have what it takes to beat an institution like Susan Collins.
The video is just so powerful because it speaks to this moment, as you say, the fact that this is someone who had a failed bid for governor and who's kind of making it up on the fly. Brendan's doing incredible work in Maine and was actually able to talk to some voters. Let's play some of that sound.
I don't think it's going to be very fun.
It could be a mess, right?
Yes, it could be a mess. It's just thrown confusion into everything. Somebody,
late date too.
The late date. Somebody said to me, or maybe it was on the news last night, saying, you know, it's like a Kamala Harris situation. Whoever walks in here is kind of behind the 8 ball right away.
Yeah, I don't know who they can get at this late in the game. Just like Harris running against Trump, you know. I mean, you know, it was too late in the game for her to get in, you know.
Ryan, how much is what happened with former Vice President Kamala Harris weighing over this moment in Maine? The parallels are extraordinary.
Every Democrat I talk to talks about what went wrong with Harris succeeding Joe Biden and not wanting to make that same mistake. They do not want any sort of an appearance that this candidate is going to be anointed in a back room, especially because Graham Platner was the exact opposite of that. He was not the establishment's pick. They did everything they could to prevent him from getting the nomination. They want the appearance that this person was picked by Maine voters and Maine voters alone. And doing it under these circumstances is a monumental task.
There's a mix of shock and relief among Democrats. Relief because this allegation didn't come out 2 weeks after it did, in which case they'd be stuck with Graham Platner. Let's also not lose sight of the fact that this is a very difficult environment for Republicans. Susan Collins is the last of these unicorns. There were several of them as recently as until last cycle who managed to survive all this time. Eventually, gravity hits and you lose. Is it going to be this cycle? Unclear, but I would not count Susan Collins as a lock to win this seat, regardless of everything we've seen.
Because the other thing, the last point I'll make is this could be exciting. It could be 2 weeks of energy and enthusiasm behind picking a new nominee. All the eyes of the world, the political world, are on Maine. If they do it right, they could capitalize on it, but it's going to be very difficult.
It sure is. Well, such fantastic reporting by both of you. Ryan, Sahil, thank you very much for capturing this moment. So many developments. We really appreciate it. And joining me now, the Maine Speaker of the House, State Representative Ryan Fecteau, whose name has been raised as a possible replacement for Platner on November's ballot. State Speaker Fecteau, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Kristen.
Well, it's great to have you. Let's start right there. You're getting a lot of buzz as a potential replacement. Do you plan to throw your hat into the ring? Are you going to run?
My focus right now is on making sure that the process that we have to elect our new nominee is fair, transparent. And as you know, as I've been saying from the beginning, when it was clear Graham was going to withdraw, and Graham actually reiterated this in that 11-minute video you've been talking about, we need to make sure that the people who are everyday Mainers, the grassroots of our party, are making this decision, not party leaders. And so that's what I'm focused on right now. We need to make sure that the grassroots, the heart and soul of our party, are making this decision.
Well, but you don't have a whole lot of time to make up your mind. I mean, the process starts now, basically. Are you leaning toward running? Can you give us some insight? I mean, time's of the essence here.
I think we need to make sure that what we are focused on is that the folks who were rallying behind Graham Platner, and there's a reason why they're rallying behind him, is because he was speaking to issues that resonate with Maine voters. They're sick and tired of not being able to afford electricity, groceries, their rent, wanting to buy a home and can't. And all of these things are stacking up against them. And it's because of a status quo, largely in Washington. And we talk about the establishment, and Graham has talked about the establishment quite a bit over the last 48 hours. There's no one who's greater establishment than Susan Collins, who's been in the United States Senate since 1996, when I was 4 years old, and has changed her stripes significantly. She went from being a maverick in the U.S. Senate, someone who was linked with Joe Lieberman, often finding compromise, and now she's a rubber stamp for Donald Trump. That's what I'm concerned about. That's what Maine voters are concerned about. The choice is going to be up to them.
If you decide not to run, who do you think is the strongest candidate right now? Who would you be willing to support to defeat Susan Collins, who, as you know, you just talked about her long record. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah, I think, Kristen, this is the exact problem. What voters do not want is party leaders like me trying to put my thumb on the scale and determining who the winner is going to be. I think I'm going to make an appeal to my fellow leaders in Maine politics who maybe are choosing not to run, that they stay out of this. They do not put their thumb on the scale. They allow Maine voters, the heart and soul of our party, to make this decision. They do not want party leaders saying who should be and who should not be the next nominee.
So let's talk about this process. The executive director of the Maine Democratic Party saying they plan on having a nominating convention before that July 27th deadline. Do you have more details about that you can share? How do you ensure that every Maine Democrat feels represented in this process?
Yeah, I've been saying it. What we're looking at is a convention that obviously will not involve every single person that cast a ballot in early June. That's just not going to be realistic, obviously. But what we will have are delegates who are going to be elected to this convention. And I think they should look at that role similar to those of us who've been elected to a state legislature. We are elected to represent our constituents. These folks are going to be elected from all across the state. They're going to have constituencies. They're folks back in their communities. They need to cast their vote after hearing what I hope is a lively debate with speeches and people exchanging ideas at this convention. I hope that the people who are elected to delegates to this convention will make a choice based on what their constituencies want versus maybe the choice that they went into the convention having already decided or having their mind sort of already made up. It's going to be important that we hear the voices of Maine voters overall.
You say these delegates are going to be elected. Can you give us some more details about that? How specifically will they be elected? Will there be a snap election to nominate these delegates? How's that going to work?
Yeah, and I'll be fully transparent. I don't have any insight into this directly. Okay. My suspicion will be that we'll have the county committees be the venue for having the delegates get elected. We've done this before for state conventions. Folks will be able to show up and have the ability to raise their hand, say they want to be considered, and if there are a number of people who exceed the number of slots, then there'll be a vote, I suspect, and the folks who win will go to the convention. I think that's the fairest way to do it.
Let me get your reaction to some of what we heard from Graham Platner and some of what we're hearing. You just heard my colleague Ryan Nobles report that he does not plan to withdraw his name until Monday, the deadline for him to withdraw. What is your reaction, and does that hamper the party's ability to move forward? Is that a final thumb in the nose?
I don't know what Graham is up to. The focus for me and Democrats across the state is making sure we defeat Susan Collins in November. Maine voters want change. They want a candidate who will speak to the very issues that Graham spoke about during the course of his candidacy. We need someone that can pick up that mantle, bring the challenge to Susan Collins, and that's my focus. I don't know what Graham's up to. That's not what's important. It's very clear he's not going to be the candidate. He's not going to be the nominee.
So should he drop out today? Should he drop out today? I mean, what's the delay?
I don't know what the delay is. I think he should do what he said he was going to do in that video, which is to withdraw and allow us to move forward with a process that will allow us to elect a tremendous candidate. We have a lot of this is a thing that I think is so important. We have a lot of really great people in Maine politics, people who believe the same things Graham believes. Graham Platner is not the only person that believes what Graham Platner believes. Graham Platner is not the only person who can string together sentences about this incredible message of changing our politics and putting working class people back in the driver's seat. That's what we need to be focused on.
We're out of time, but I just very quickly, there were a number of controversies swirling around Graham Platner prior to this final allegation of rape, which he denies. Past girlfriends alleging he was aggressive toward them. He denied that as well. Of course, this Nazi tattoo, which he says he didn't know what the implications, what it actually meant. Do you think Democrats and his top supporters and endorsers failed in terms of their judgment and lack of vetting him and lack of seeing that he was a candidate who, by his own admission, could not move forward?
I think the fact that Graham Platner took off is really indicative of our politics right now. People are frustrated.
What about all of those controversies that were overlooked by so many people? Was it a failure?
I think it speaks to the frustration people have. They're looking for someone who's going to be a change maker, and they're willing to forgive some past misdoings. I certainly was very concerned about those misgivings, but at the end of the day, Maine voters were willing to take a risk because they see the stakes in their own lives being only getting greater and greater as the challenges they face back home are pinching their wallets and causing them economic harm. People want change, and they want to see Susan Collins no longer be a U.S. Senator.
All right, State Speaker Fecteau, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your perspective. We're going to continue to follow this very closely. Really appreciate your joining us.
Thank you.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.